So at some stage of any successful entrepreneur's career, one will muse, is it time to go to the markets? For some, it's a new venture. Others, it's a wake-up call, a harsh wake-up call. And a treasure trove on the other side. There is clearly a lot to be gained from going to the markets. You get a currency for expansion, access to capital markets, and greater visibility for better or for worse. And these are some of the questions we're going to try and get at in this debate today with Pat Phelan, who sold his company, InvestEv, 2 years ago to a now listed company, and David Siegel, who runs the largest finance education site. But before we get started, I wanted to just get a quick show of hands. Who here thinks that on balance, it's ultimately better to be on the markets when you hit a certain stage of your company? Who thinks that's a positive thing, being listed? Wow, not very many. So on that note, why don't we kick off a couple minutes with Pat's views, and then we'll seg for a couple minutes to David. Pat?
Thank you. For me, I think the markets, I think now is the perfect time to move to the markets. I think companies are probably making errors and going late. I think it's causing massive problems to entrepreneurs like me. Guys, you know, I've built 3 or 4 companies, I've exited most of them, and I think by not going or holding so late, you're drying up capital markets, you're floating too late, you're losing your best teams. You know, we see it constantly. Senior players have now vested, they're leaving the company and are not waiting around. And I think also what's happening, if you're looking at the journey of most super startup unicorns, etc., you've got a lot of late stage debt on your books that you're probably borrowing at really inefficient rates. So I think there's a time where you say the team needs to be paid, we need to get the venture guys out, and we need to get the venture back into the market. Because I think most people here would agree, we are certainly seeing a drying of A and early B stage venture, because venture now has to support guys to, 10 and 15 billion up to 60 in some unusual cases. They have to support that, and the problem they're having is where before you'd go with a 4 million seed, 7 million A, 15 million B, you're kind of in for 25 million. Now you're trying to write a path to $1 billion. And I think the problem, that's killing venture. So I think let's get these. Spotify, I think, is probably the next most famous one at somewhere around 15 billion we're hearing. Let's get them out there. Let's free up the teams. And more importantly, these team members, once these funds will come back in, will absolutely capitalize seed markets as well. So it'll lead to much more companies coming in my opinion.
Okay. Let's hear from you, David, who thinks it's not such a great idea to go public.
Okay. Who here has ever used Investopedia? Raise your hand. Yes. Okay, thank you. Each time you use it, we get 4 cents. And there's a whole lot of articles on Investopedia about pros and cons of IPOs, and I'm going to tell you the con side. So here we go. A recent report just came out by McKinsey, and it talked about the fact that tech companies are staying private for 3 times longer than they ever did in the past. 50% of these companies are actually getting IPOs at a profitable stage versus only 10% about 10 years ago. Over $150 billion is just sitting in venture capital funds waiting to be invested as alternatives to IPOs. And when you hear about all these companies waiting, well, there's a good reason for that. The reason for it is I'm going to talk about a couple things. Number one is the time and the cost. On the time side, typical IPO, we're talking about 6 to 9 months of work. Sometimes it takes as long as 2 years from the conception of having an IPO to actually moving forward to it. What happens during that 2-year time period? A very bad thing for management happens. It's called distraction. Management gets distracted and doesn't focus necessarily all the things on the business, but focus instead on investor relations. They're focusing on reporting. They're focusing on meetings with attorneys, etc. Now let's talk about the cost side. And there's three major costs. The first cost is just the initial upfront cost. You have the underwriter who's going to take 5 to 7%. You have legal costs, accounting costs, registration costs, tons of costs that you now have to bear as an organization. That's just the first step. Now, from an ongoing perspective, you also have a lot more costs. You have SEC quarterly and annual filings, reporting costs, disclosure costs, proxy statements. Many times companies need to spend literally millions of dollars in upgrading their IT systems, their financial systems, all their different systems in order to be compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. These are serious costs. The last cost I'm going to talk about now is the cost of what oftentimes happens, which is a major issue in IPOs, which is underpricing. According to a study that was recently done, New York Times just reported about it, in the last 50 years, the average IPO has been underpriced in the US by about 17%. That amounts to over $200 billion loss in underpricing, which is a major cost for a company. China underpricing is like 150%. Internationally, it's about 20%. So just to summarize, there's a big reason why IPOs have been delayed. Number one reason is because of time and because of cost.
Okay, so, I mean, let's look at that a little bit. The distraction and the cost that David's eloquently outlined here, is it worth it?
I mean, you're talking about underpricing. Venture's the most underpriced thing in the world, so it's impossible to collaborate the two, because you're taking early money at a guessed price. Now you're talking about you might guess the later stage wrong, so that makes no sense in my opinion. I think on the cost side, eventually these companies are going to IPO anyway, whether it's later or earlier. So the cost is going to be there. It's only going up. It's not coming down. And I think the other thing is, a lot of people talk about a complete lack of innovation post-IPO. I mean, who's got an iPhone, or who's getting an iPhone X?
I am.
Public company. So, you look at what Apple's done since it went public, especially look at what Amazon's done since it went public. It returned massive capital for all the staff who invested in early stage startups. It returned massive capital for the investors. And it's a circular thing. You see that movement where all the guys in Facebook, as Facebook went public, everyone in Facebook became a serial investor across all of the valley. It started more companies, so you have to do it.
Okay, I'll make sorry.
No, sorry.
I'll just make a couple of points to your points. First one is, not necessarily every company needs to have an IPO. Let me just say that. Cargill, they're worth $120 billion. Cargill is a private company. Uber's last round or recent round was about $65 billion. How are they going to be able to return dollars back to their investors at a $65 billion type valuation, or $100 billion type valuation? I don't necessarily think that every company needs to make an IPO. I do think that for the time period post-IPO, there is less innovation. Yes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 years later, Apple is certainly 10, 15 years later, there's obviously huge opportunities for an IPO. But I'm talking about that critical year or two time period where founders are more focused on roadshows and more focused on prospectuses than necessarily focused on the core business. And the other, obviously, issue for major founders is losing control. A major issue. When you're a private company, you usually have a lot more of an ability to influence your board, influence your investors. When you go public, everyone could be an investor. I could be an investor. You could be an investor. Jackie could be an investor. You could have activist investors. You could have people taking over. You could have people on the board that you don't like very much. These are major issues with having an IPO that people aren't fully aware of.
That's why you create B shares.
Fair enough.
That's a good point, but I got to call you out a little bit on the Uber example, because something the public markets do very well is holding people accountable. The $69 billion Uber valuation, now it's being quoted in the gray market, the secondary market, at closer to $40 billion.
Right.
If they've been a public company, they've been listed with all the string of issues they've had this year, we'd see the market pricing in some of the risk and some of that, holding them accountable for some of this.
So first of all, I agree. I think that there are, in the case of Uber, and it's a great example, and just to take the other side, for example, Uber went crazy and did not have the right compliance-related issues. All the things that they did, certainly from a gender standpoint, are appalling. And had they been more of a public company, then there would have been more controls there. So I honestly completely agree with you about that particular instance, and that's a good example where an IPO is a positive.
Okay. There
are many examples, and I'll just quote something in terms of returns. Jeremy Siegel, the famous Wharton professor, and I like him since that's the school that I went to, he looked at about 9,000 companies that had done IPOs over the last 30 years. And he looked at the returns of those companies in the 3 to 5 year period post an IPO relative to someone who invested in a small cap index. And get ready for this. 29 of 33 years, the small cap index ended up doing far better than the first years of companies post IPO. There's just a lot of data out there that investing in companies post IPO tends to lag the market more broadly, and that has major implications for employees of those companies whose stock options may be underwater, et cetera.
I disagree totally. I mean, we IPO'd 2 years ago. I think the price has doubled. So, you know, you can find cases everywhere. But I'm sure when Uber will IPO, and I'm sure when Spotify will IPO, I'm sure Shervin and Menlo Park and those guys are going to be extraordinarily happy. You have to free capital you have to free the early capital, you have to free capital for the early employees. There is just no other way.
And you don't think that there are other vehicles for freeing capital that exist today?
But the people that buy the capital are waiting for the IPO anyway. So if someone comes in and says, I'm going to buy, I think there was an exercise last week where someone bought $1 billion worth of stock from early employees. The guys who bought $1 billion are waiting for the IPO. So, you know, they're being promised returns as well.
Well, they're either waiting for an IPO or they're waiting for the company to be acquired. It doesn't necessarily, the only form of liquidity is not just an IPO. You have secondary markets,
but if you're late stage and you take it too far, you get to a position where IPO is the only option.
You think so?
Yeah, absolutely.
There are giant companies.
How many billion-dollar applications or how many billion-dollar acquisitions of private startups have you seen in the last 5 years?
I think So I think your point is something that we'd probably agree with, which is that the importance of doing an IPO has a major impact on how large the company is in the first place. If you're in the unicorn stage, you're $1 billion plus, and you don't necessarily have any other vehicles for having an IPO, then besides an IPO for getting that money out, then that makes sense. If you're $100 million, $200 million, $300 million, there are many opportunities to be acquired. There are opportunities in secondary markets as well. And what my fears are, my concerns are, is that the average market capitalization of a company that has an IPO is not $1.1 billion. It's closer to $200-300 million or so. So there are many companies that are having IPOs very early stage that it's not necessarily the best path for them. David, that's what I'm most concerned about.
Can I just jump in and go back to the point of B shares and just what is your take, generally of super voting and non-voting shares as a way to concentrate, founder control, like Snap, like Facebook? What's your take on that as a out?
My take is that the founder can get away with getting 10 times the voting rights with an A share, and everyone else has a B share. All the power to that founder for being able to accomplish it. Is that in the best interest of shareholders? Absolutely not. Yeah. If I'm an investor and I know that my company has basically, my CEO can own 8% of the company but have 80%, let's say, of the voting rights, then there's no checks and balances there. I'm terrified, I'm scared, and it's ultimately not good for the investor, which usually is not good ultimately for the stock price appreciation.
Let me just come back to that in a second, but I spoke to a CEO of a startup company, oversubscribed, was thrilled, turned away a VC, and one of the reasons she turned away the VC is she felt that VC coming in would cause her to have him call the shots, and she doesn't want anyone else calling the shots. My question is there a guarantee that you keep your soul even if you avoid the markets?
I mean, I think it's down to the venture firm. I've raised money many times I've had really good venture partners. I don't see it. I think it's down. I think it's down to the investor. Most of my investors are large, well-known investors: Notion, Greycroft, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They tend to support you, and I find venture to be all about the entrepreneur. All about the entrepreneur.
I tend to agree. Some venture capital firms are very short-term oriented. If the advice I would give to an entrepreneur is take less money from a venture capital firm that you are more aligned with from a timing standpoint than to get a higher valuation and potentially more money for someone who's going to have a more short-term orientation. I think we would definitely both agree with that.
There's a chance that you can lose your soul, but what about that perennial gap between, the pre-market valuation and then when they come in the markets, it's like, oh my God, this is the harsh reality I was talking about in the beginning. And we've seen that with HelloFresh. Yep. I know they had a little uptick last week, but they're still relatively down. I think pre-market was 2.6 billion now, it's 1.6 roughly when I last looked. How do you kind of keep your soul when you're losing your worth?
Many companies don't. I was at a company, it was called Everyday Health. I was an executive in the company. The company decided to go public, and we essentially shut down every single business area. There was a high investment area. There was a high innovation area that was driving significant revenue growth, but was actually losing money because the company was going to be having a multiple to EBITDA. That's an example among many companies that had that. The shares ended up ultimately tanking, and it was ultimately then acquired as a public company. But the number of companies that take a short-term orientation because of the fact that they're now focused on profit is, I'm not going to say the majority of them, but a very high number of companies.
Right.
I think what you are seeing is, especially in groceries, especially in meals, you're looking at companies that probably shouldn't have IPO'd anyway.
Agree.
Dramatic losses, dramatic customer acquisition, insane customer acquisition costs, and the minute they go public, everything's on the table. All the numbers are there for everyone to see, and I think it spooks the market.
I agree.
I want to just point out another very high-profile instance. That what Bloomberg columnist yesterday said that 8 months after going public, Snap is a disaster. The Q3 earnings were down, the shares tanked. Now it's changing its app to make it easier to the end user. My question is, can this be a force of good, the transparency that allows change that benefits the person on the end?
I mean, I think Uber is a great example of what, like we said before, that the transparency would have been a big positive. I think Snap is another example of that, where now Twitter's another example of that, I may add, where there's potentially more product innovation because of the fact that there's more transparency.
Okay, so on the one hand,
I think Snap's problem wasn't, I don't think it had anything to do with going public. I think they went public a little early, but I think the problem is Insta stories are killing them.
Right.
Okay. So on the one hand, just wrapping up here, we've got late stage debt markets, retention. You have a lot of reasons to go public. As we outlined at the beginning, you have cost issues, you have distraction. I just want to see how many of you were swayed after hearing Pat and David. Can I just take another audience survey? Who thinks now it would be good to go to the markets? Can I see another round of hand?
Dramatic change.
Sorry, Pat. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Okay.